Hi, I'm Oliver and this is Deep Cuts, a channel dedicated to music for lovers of music. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the first guide. If you're here and you haven't seen the first guide, I'd suggest going to watch the first guide first so everything makes chronological sense. This is the second video in my Bowie week that I'm doing. I'm going to be putting the final video up on Saturday, so look out for that. One thing I do want to point out before I continue with the guide is that from this point onwards there are a number of moments in Bowie's career where the quality takes a slight dip, let's say, and I don't want you to be watching this and thinking, God, he's being really harsh on these records when he was being so sort of verbose about the first half of records. But the problem with that is that the thing is many of the records that he made in the beginning half of his career are absolute masterpieces, and there are a number of records that aren't that great that he made later on. There's still some great records, don't get me wrong, there's some fantastic records, but there are a number that aren't that good, or aren't as good certainly, and I don't want people to think I'm just shitting on these records. I'm not. I'm trying to have a critical discussion about this discography, I'm not like an apologist for the artist. I'm not just going to say something's great because it's David Bowie. He himself was a self-criticizer, and it's a very healthy thing to do as an artist, and we shouldn't all just put someone on a pedestal and immediately assume all of the music is perfect and amazing, because some of it isn't. So I just wanted to get that out there as a disclaimer before I continue, basically. Anyway, on to 1979's Lodger. Lodger is a record with ambitions to be another Low and another Heroes, and while it doesn't quite hit those levels of quality, it's still an ambitious LP that really tries as hard as it can to push new sonic ground and incorporate new elements such as new wave, for example. This album concludes the Berlin trilogy, with Visconti and Eno producing once again alongside Bowie. But even though it's part of this trilogy idea, it's not very thematically linked the way Low and Heroes was, with its binary qualities, all of that sort of thing. It's a completely different kind of record, and really that whole thing was a marketing ploy to try and sell this strange and different collection of music to an audience who loved both Low and Heroes. The album does have a loose concept of itself though, which is a lodger traversing the landscapes and feeling quite lost and alone, and the technologies of the world making him feel very isolated and lonely. The tracks from this album are all 3 to 4 minutes long, and they remind me stylistically of that twisted rock and roll from the first half of Low and the first half of Heroes. It's like accessible melodies fed through a mangling machine of production that makes them just out of reach. Eno uses instruments like the Eroica horn, horse trumpet, prepared piano, and ambient drones to really push the sonic sound and the exploratory nature of the LP. Mid-album track DJ could be a very simple funk rock track if not for the screeching violin samples that are littered throughout the song, which obfuscates it slightly. The track African Night Flight is this nightmare of semitonal piano notes and proto-rapping from David, and these cutting synth samples courtesy of Eno, and it's unfathomable and frenetic and brilliant. Look Back in Anger is an energetic anthem which is powered by the paradiddle-flecked performance from drummer Dennis Davis, and a fantastic track. Certainly a very good album, and another insight into David Bowie's fierce willingness to push the boundaries and forge a path that's unlit through music, and this is why this is one of his most interesting periods of creativity in his entire career. In September of 1980, Scary Monsters and Super Creeps landed, which marked a new era in the singer's now extensive back catalogue of music. This is his 14th LP in only 13 years. And the number of different stylistic modes, different ideas, different styles of music. It's just amazing everything he achieved in this short amount of time, and really just trailblazed a path through popular music as everybody knew it at the time. Whereas the Berlin trilogy was a critical and creative success, it didn't do quite as well chart-wise for David. The general public were less interested in this style of music as they were with Ziggy Stardust, Diamond Dogs, Aladdin Sane, Hunky Dory, that era of music from him. With Scary Monsters, however, Bowie managed to strike a deft balance between his yearning for creativity and his yearning for commercial success, and he crafted an album that is probably more accessible than the last 3 records, but it still has a creative streak in it. It's still a vital record in his discography. The sonic aesthetic of this record is hard-edged. It's distorted rock flecked with dance passages like the wah pedal guitar on the track Fashion, which sounds like the blueprint of the band INXS's late 1980s hits. I think if you go into this record expecting a completely change of tack from the style of music that happened in the Berlin trilogy era, you will really enjoy the quality and you'll be able to appreciate this release a lot better. Some people cry sellout when they think about this record because it yearns for a more commercial success, but fuck those people. This is still a really good record, and stuff doesn't have to be avant-garde and inaccessible to be a really great record. Ziggy Stardust and Hunky Dory are not avant-garde records, but they're fantastic records, so that doesn't hold true. And perhaps Bowie could be accused of selling out a little bit more as we get more into the 80s, and I'll talk about that in a bit, but I certainly feel like on this record that he's still at the height of his creativity, just in a different mode. Opening track It's No Game Part 1 utilises jagged electric guitar from guitarist Robert Fripp, and it has this 4-to-the-floor drum beat and Bowie's harsh, squealing vocal delivery over the top. The Japanese singer Michi Harota authoritatively speaks over the track, and this was apparently Bowie's way of commenting on the sexist attitudes towards Eastern women in the 1980s. Ashes to Ashes was obviously a huge hit single, with Bowie bringing Major Tom from Space Oddity out of retirement, but now he's a junkie. There's that really iconic guitar synthesizer lick courtesy of Chuck Hammer, which really epitomises this track and makes it so memorable for everybody. And then there's that aggressive slap bass which permeates the entire song. Just a really brilliant track. As much as this track's a reflection of his own drug addiction, it's also a really great earworm of a track, with Bowie singing Ashes to Ashes, Funk to Funky. We know Major Tom's a junkie, strung out in heaven's high, hitting an all-time low. Another assured, confident, and brilliant album. In '81, Bowie paired up with Queen to release the track Under Pressure, which was a huge single success. High off of the commercial success of Scary Monsters and of the single Under Pressure, in 1983, Bowie releases Let's Dance, which is really his record where he fully embraces the mainstream and he takes on the sounds of disco, pop, and rock to create a very successful album commercially for him, and it spawned the singles Modern Love, China Girl, and obviously Let's Dance. Bowie famously paired up with Chic's Nile Rodgers to produce this album, which actually upset Tony Visconti considerably and damaged their relationship quite a bit. They didn't work together again for quite a long time after this period. Bowie wanted to work with Rodgers in order to be able to create a collection of surefire hits, but even in his own eyes, that backfired somewhat. It was great in its way, but it put me in a real corner in that it fucked with my integrity. It was only meant as a one-off project. I had every intention of continuing to do some unusual material after that. But the success of that record really forced me in a way to continue the beast. It was my own doing, of course, but I felt after a few years that I had gotten stuck. I think it shows that this album was developed to create big bucks. If you listen to the lavish production and the safe songwriting, it doesn't develop a very interesting listen, certainly when compared to the preceding album Scary Monsters and then the entire era in Berlin before that. But you can't really argue with the single success of the track Let's Dance and also Modern Love. They are really great single tracks in their own way. Let's Dance's pop dance inflections are so brilliantly realised by Rodgers and Bowie, and it's complete with a Stevie Ray Vaughan guitar piece. It just makes the whole song so tasty and instantly recognisable, and probably one of Bowie's biggest singles in his entire career, commercially successful wise. Elsewhere on the record there are tracks like Without You, which just never really leaves its mark, and this is the problem I have with the tracks on this album that aren't the China Girl, Modern Love and Let's Dance. They just don't leave a mark on you. They're so wanting to please everybody that they end up not really having their own identity, and that's the biggest downfall of this record. And despite having a guitarist like Stevie Ray Vaughan guesting on many of the tracks, it doesn't push the album up to any great height or to much of an interesting listen for me anyway, personally. Having said that, the halftime head nodder Criminal Underworld is probably one of my favourite tracks on here that wasn't a single, and it's backed up with Rob Sabino's ethereal keyboard parts and that beefy bass guitar sound. Ultimately, this album feels like a vehicle for the singles, which can't really be said for any of other Bowie's releases bar perhaps Space Oddity. So yeah, it's not a particularly great album, not in my eyes anyway. We've really hit a couple of turkeys here. This was bound to happen. This is 16 LPs in, unbelievably. Okay, so the following year, in 1984, Bowie releases Tonight, which really feels like a massive filler album amongst a couple of good tracks. In retrospect, Bowie's actually referred to this period as his Phil Collins period, which, as someone who doesn't really like anything post Lamb Lies Down on Broadway Phil Collins I find quite funny. If you like Phil Collins, you might not find that funny, but hey, opinions. Opening track Loving the Alien is a synthetic, moody song which is characterised by this marimba performance and theatrical strings. A really good track. Likewise, Blue Jean was a chart success, but the track doesn't really do anything for me. It's just boring. There's nothing very interesting about it. It doesn't really have a personality. Bowie didn't have much input into this record. He famously stood back and allowed the session musicians to do what they needed to do, along with Nile Rodgers doing the production. And because he didn't have much input, I think that's probably why the record sounds so lifeless and sterile. A track like Don't Look Down is just cringe as hell. This reggae dance disco wank that makes me want to be sick. It's such a crap song, and it's actually a cover of an Iggy Pop song which was far better in its original incarnation on his '79 album New Values. A lot of the tracks are covers too. God Only Knows is a 1966 Beach Boys song, and then obviously the track I Keep Forgetting is a Chuck Jackson cover. Yeah, just not good overall. This album's just not good. This might be an artistic low for Bowie, but really he'd never been so popular. You know, these new singles and these new albums with their dance-inflect sound were proving to be really popular amongst younger people who didn't have an attachment to his early 70s and late 70s output, and this was helped with things like his appearance in the film Labyrinth as Jareth the Goblin King. All these things were building up a persona of Bowie that was very different to his trend-setting and forward-thinking personas and stylistic modes during the 70s. Also, Bowie and Mick Jagger covered the Martha Reeve and the Vandellas Dancing in the Street for Live Aid, which became a huge #1 success in a lot of countries. Unfortunately, this next one's a bit shit too. Sorry. 1987's Never Let Me Down. Despite the critical panning Tonight was awarded, Bowie's success continued commercially, record sales were very good, and he tried to change up the sound on this record to a more beefy rock sound, but really this didn't particularly go down well either. It feels like the whole record is trying as hard as possible to create an identity based on the sum of loads of different contemporary musical trends at that time, and it just doesn't succeed in doing anything with that. The whole aesthetic for this record was a conscious move by Bowie to try and move away from that overproduced stadium-y pop rock dance sound that Let's Dance and Tonight had, and creating a sound that was more enabled for a live performance. I knew that I wanted something I could tour with on a very ground roots level. I wanted something that would work well with a small band because I wanted a lot of performers on stage other than just a band. So it had to logistically be a 5-piece band kind of music. I wrote small but energetically. The words ground roots and small, it imagines something much less overblown than the last two records, but then you realise that Bowie partnered up with Pepsi for the 1987 tour. We'll let you off, David. I think it's safe to say that although Bowie tried toning things down and developing a process of reduction on this album, creating something that feels more alive, really, from a production standpoint, the album is so tinkered with and overproduced, much like the sound from the last two records, that it just ends up sounding like a product and not an alive, breathing piece of music. Bowie himself said something of this nature. I really should have not done it quite so studio-ly. I think some of it was a waste of really good songs. You should hear the demos from those albums. It's night and day by comparison with the finished tracks. There's stuff on the two albums since Let's Dance that I could really kick myself about. When I listen to those demos, it's, how did it turn out like that? Hey, I quite like the second track, Time Will Crawl, though. It's a relatively whiffy slice of cheese with like booming gated drums. It's very 80s, and Bowie's providing his own overwrought harmony line to his own vocal performance. So I quite like that song, and it has a charm about it that really lacks on the majority of the tracks on this album. All in all, I'd steer clear if you're looking for somewhere to start. At this point, David was pretty fed up with his solo career. It must be very hard to be a very creative person. On one side, have all this massive commercial success, but on the other side, you're feeling like you're being battered by critics and not having your creativity validated, because let's be honest, that's what artists tend to care about in the end more, leaving a legacy of music rather than selling records. And David said something similar. It was great. I'd become accessible to a huge audience, but not terribly fulfilling. So it's no surprise really that he decided to change up the format and do something entirely different. So between 88 and 92, Bowie fronted the rock band Tin Machine, which had Reeves Gabrels on guitar, Tony Sales on bass, and then his brother Hunt Sales on drums. He was very keen to be part of a band rather than fronting another ostensibly David Bowie project. He craved an anonymity to allow him to get back some of that artistic focus that his previous solo records were lacking on. Tin Machine is hard rock inspired by Jimi Hendrix, Cream, and the ragged production style of bands like the Pixies. The first album was released in May 1989 and received varied critical reviews. People weren't really sure how to take this new mode of David Bowie. It's very different from the last 3 albums and also anything else that he'd done at that point. I'm not really a huge fan of the Tin Machine project. I'm starting to sound like a broken record a little bit for this period of Bowie's releases, but again, it just lacks an identity. It lacks an identity and a focus, and it doesn't make it a very engaging listen for me personally. It's certainly a more enjoyable listen to than Let Me Down though, and there's a track, Pretty Things, which is frayed and dynamic, and you can clearly see that the production is geared towards an entire band rather than just to Bowie's vocal delivery. The band released Tin Machine 2 in 1991, and during this time, Bowie left EMI, a label that he'd been with for many years. Fresh from his marriage with the Somali fashion model Iman, in 1993, David Bowie releases Black Tie, White Noise, which is a welcome change of pace and style from the previous record. Bowie teamed up once again with Nile Rodgers, and together they ransacked his all of the influences from his career up until this point and created something that's really a pleasure to listen to. They used a lot of elements of jazz, soul, and even incorporated hip-hop into the sonic palette of this record. There's a significant soul influence flowing through this record, and I don't mean the kind of plastic soul from 1975's Young Americans. I'm talking about the feeling soul gives you in its atmosphere and its delivery, not like the way that Plastic Soul tries to create a simulacra of that music specifically, rather the tone and the mood and the flow, the feeling that soul music gives you. Rodgers' production ensures the record feels slick, but it doesn't feel bombastic like 1983's Let's Dance. That just wouldn't work with this kind of songwriting. There's no apologetic, submissive single writing in this album. You can tell this is a return to form for Bowie's experimentation, his yearning for creativity, and you can tell it's not an album that's just trying to shift units. This becomes clear on opening track The Wedding, which is a tribute to David's marriage to Iman. There's this synth bass and tuned wedding bells, and that gets suffused with a house-style piano motif and wah pedal guitar. And the track's instrumental, and it's quite a long track, and eventually the track is joined by Bowie's wandering sax line. The whole thing feels like a statement. It's like, I'm here, I'm back, I've matured. Track You've Been Around has a menacing deep synth and electronic drums underpinning a monolithic vocal performance. You can almost hear David relishing the weird and the wonderful once again. The single Jump They Say is an ode to Bowie's half-brother Terry, who committed suicide in 1985, and it really catches you off guard because it's quite a happy-go-lucky verse sound which morphs into this very emotive chorus complete with very emotive lyrics. They say he has no brain. They say he has no mood. They say he was born again. They say, look at him climb. They say, jump. A great record overall, a return to form of experimentation and oddity. Might not be one of his best records, but it's great to hear him back at this level of creativity once again. The Buddha of Suburbia, also released in 1993, was originally a TV soundtrack for the adaptation of the novel of the same name, The Buddha of Suburbia. But Bowie also released an album this year which had the same title, but it wasn't the soundtrack itself. This was actually an album entirely of its own thing, with loosely the same ideas, a couple of the same musical motifs, but it's a different work from the soundtrack that he wrote. Bowie self-produced this album and says himself that he pulled from a lot of 70s memories, bringing together ideas and themes that he once had, which created a collage of sounds and styles, a very reflective LP for him. The whole album was recorded and mixed in a week, which is insane, and alongside the same year's release of Black Tie, White Noise, it proves that Bowie's back experimenting and taking chances with his music. Even though the influences on paper sound like a complete mess, you know, ideas from him in the 70s as well as this soundtrack for a novel as well, it sounds like it could be a little bit messy, but it surprisingly coheres very well. It's an enjoyable listen. Sex and the Church has this great infectious dance rhythm punctured by Bowie's metallic treated voice, and there's this polyrhythmic Hammond organ colliding with cutting electronic sampling. Influences from the Berlin years slink onto this release with wandering and spacious instrumentals like the track The Mysteries and the equally languorous Ian Fish UK Air. The title track, Buddha of Suburbia, is brilliant, its crescendo chorus bolstered by wistful saxophone. Sadly, it's an album that often gets overlooked due to the fact there was a soundtrack and the TV adaptation, and then there's this separate album with different tracks on it. But it's a good album, and it's a shame that it gets overlooked. Actually, I just realised that I've been saying 25 albums all this time, and I haven't been counting the Buddha of Suburbia. What a knob I am. 95's LP Outside reunited Bowie and Brian Eno for the first time since 79's Lodger, and they both went into the studio knowing they wanted to create something that was missing from the current musical landscape. We realised we were both interested in nibbling at the periphery of the mainstream rather than jumping in. We sent each other long manifestos about what was missing in music and what we should be doing. We decided to really experiment and go into the studio with not even a gnat of an idea. This record feels like Bowie's second most conceptual album, even saying himself that the album has strong smatterings of Diamond Dogs. The idea of this post-apocalyptic situation is there, somehow. You can kind of feel it. This record started out as much more than a loose concept idea, though. In the studio, Bowie and Eno were creating this complex, non-linear art project with music involved, which detailed this near future where people were killing other people in an artistic fashion, and it was becoming a new trend of ways of people expressing themselves. So that idea of art and murder converging was where this LP was created. Eno crafted much of this record in his typically idiosyncratic way. At one point he was handing cards out to the session musicians and giving them bizarre ways in which to play their instruments. You are a disgruntled ex-member of a South African rock band. Play the notes they won't allow. I love that one, that's just brilliant. This album's always fascinated me. It's a strange album, and as you listen to it, you can really hear Bowie and Eno have tried to push this record out to the farthest reaches of odd as possible, and that certainly comes through when you're listening to it. The Heart's Filthy Lesson is a garbled trip-hop track with an instantly iconic violin sample as the main refrain, and the drums underpin the track, but they're joined by dark, industrial, distorted guitar and tinkling piano. I don't know what that was. That wasn't me tinkling piano, that's just me waving or something. Ignore that. Elsewhere, the track Motel is a wandering, slow burn ballad with a mean streak, and Bowie's vocal delivery is spectral and haunting, which is a style of delivery that he would later deliver on his final LP, Black Star. It's funny, the record is ultimately quite uneven in its quality, but I forgive it for that. Because I really enjoy the fact that Bowie and Eno are pushing for this experimentation and this uniqueness throughout. And if you are exploring Bowie's discography for the first time, it's really worth putting this album in there because it's such an interesting period for this musician's music. Get ready for something completely different once again. In February 1997, David Bowie releases Earthling, a self-produced record with a basis of electronic, jungle, and drum and bass. Yeah, that's right, you heard me correctly. A jungle drum and bass album from David Bowie. I really don't know how I feel about this record. I still can't decide whether it's a tongue-in-cheek blend of aggressive rock and jungle drum and bass trends of the 90s, or it's just a misguided attempt of doing the zeitgeist better. I'd be interested to see what you guys think. Let me know in the comments section. My opinions on this are quite neatly bundled up into the opening track Little Wonder. When the jungle beat starts, my cringeometer really kicks in and starts ramping up. But then as Bowie and the distorted electric guitar arrives on the track, weirdly it works. I don't think it should work, but for some reason it does. It pulls off a cheeky capriciousness. By the time that you get through the chorus, the track has moved so far away from electronica, no pun intended if you know the lyrics, it startles me when it kicks back in. I'm Afraid of Americans was the successful single off of this record. It's this half-time electro-rock groover that has this completely explosive chorus. I listened to it with headphones on again recently, and it blew my head clear off my shoulders. Not literally, obviously. Interestingly, Bowie had recently toured with Trent Reznor's Nine Inch Nails, and when you listen to the industrial, spiky distortion hybridized with electronic beats and sampling, I think you can hear a clear influence from Nine Inch Nails on this album. The track Battle for Britain is pretty terrible, overdriven guitar, jarring with these hyperactive jungle rhythms that feel like they've just been laid over the top. Doesn't really work for me. Likewise, Telling Lies feels like almost a carbon copy of the opening Little Wonder, but it doesn't pull off the same charm that that track does. Overall, much like Outside, this is an album that ends up being pretty uneven. There's some great tracks, there's some not so great tracks, but it's a really good album to listen to really show an indication of the now 50-year-old David Bowie, who is constantly pushing his style. He's not resting on his back catalogue. All those successful records from the 70s and 80s, which he could quite easily do so, he's not doing that. He's pushing forward and always being creative and always trying to push the boundaries of his own music. In 1999, the experimentalism of the previous two LPs is dialed back. Ours is a pretty straightforward rock and pop album produced by guitarist Gabriel Reeves from Tin Machine. God, that album art is terrible. No, seriously, look at it up close. Look how bad that album art is. Look at all the different fonts, makes me feel sick. If not for Diamond Dogs, this would probably be my least favourite David Bowie album art. But well done, Diamond Dogs, you're still winning. You know what, I don't really want to talk about this record. It's so boring. This is, for me, that's the reason it sits right at the bottom of the pile for me. It's such a boring album. Even some of his weakest releases like Pin-Ups and Never Let Me Down, they have interesting things about them, whereas for me, every track just segues into one another in such a bland way that nothing stands out. Hey, I might be alone in this. Many critics seem to review the record well, stating it was a mature album from Bowie. But mature doesn't have to mean boring. I think a lot of critics really hated 97's Earthling, therefore, in comparison, Ours was a much more mature work, whatever mature means. But for me, it's just a boring album. I prefer Earthling. It's bold and it takes risks and it doesn't just bloatedly lie there as Ours seems to do. I would say Survive is a good track to listen to if you want an idea of what this album sounds like. It's these bland strings accompanied by a meandering vocal line that just is completely forgotten the second the track stops playing. Put this at the bottom of the pile. In 2002, record Heathen marked the return of Tony Visconti producing, who hadn't produced anything since 1980's Scary Monsters. Bowie was in a strange place at the time. He'd recently completed an album called Toy, which was a load of unreleased tracks from the 60s that he'd retooled. But Virgin, his record label, didn't want to release the album, and as such it left him very frustrated and upset. So he really wanted to make sure that he'd arrive at a juncture where he got the next album perfectly right. They travelled to a remote recording location in the mountains just outside of New York and began the process of writing, composing and producing the music that would become Heathen. Visconti made some interesting remarks about the way they tried to keep the songwriting as unique as possible. We listened to contemporary things to avoid copying them. The few times he has copied people, you can tell. He's always been an innovator. Heathen is quite a maligned Bowie release. Many people put it at the bottom of the pile in terms of quality, but I'd have to disagree with that. I don't think it's an amazing album by any means, but I do feel like you can hear a reinvigoration courtesy of Visconti doing production duties once again. It's like the duo are back and they're creating music, and I can hear some of that magic in the music as I listen to it. Also, anything's good after Hours, am I right? Nah, I'm only joking. Maybe. Opening track Sunday is incredibly sultry, Bowie crooning with a sophisticated grace, accompanied by reverby drums and a wraith-like choir. There's a powerful message in its lyricism which is potentially informed by 9/11, which happened during the creation of this album. Look for the drifters, we should crawl under the bracken. Look for the shafts of light on the road, where the heat goes. It's hard not to notice the allusions within the lyricism, but also the themes of economic depression that was racking America, and it was felt by millions of people in the country. Slip Away is another great track, a ballad that was originally recorded for the Toy record, but was then re-recorded for this album. I Took a Trip on a Gemini Spaceship is a strange song. It feels a little bit out of place on this album, in my opinion. It sounds like something off of the Earthling sessions, actually, with its X-Filesy synth sounds and frenetic drum samples. Just doesn't quite fit that sophisticated grace that was promised at the beginning of the album. All in all, this feels like the mature album. If we're going to use that word mature, whatever that means, graceful or autumnal, however you want to put it, it's this album, I think, that does that, much more so than 99's Hours does. But hey, that's, again, my opinion. Only a year later, 2003's Reality lands, and for a long while was considered the last David Bowie album. Where Heathen was dour and reflective in its mood, in a good way in my opinion, Reality kicks everything back into gear again. It possesses an energy that Hours desperately lacked, but Heathen purposely forgoes. The album possesses a cheeky wink, and it's in that track Pablo Picasso with its pretty ridiculous lyrics and Bowie's over-the-top shouty delivery. Pablo Picasso never got called an arsehole, while the girls would turn the colour of a juicy avocado. When he would drive down their street in his Eldorado, well, he was only 5'3", but the girls could not resist his stare. It's a bit of fun. The whole album is fun, actually, and I think that word is a perfect characterisation. Visconti and Bowie aren't trying to create this new masterpiece. It feels like they're enjoying their time in the studio, and that comes out on this record. I could be in a minority on that opinion, and I know that not all of the album is completely irreverent in its tone, but certainly some of it is, and that's the mode that seems to take centre stage for me as I listen to it. Looking for Water is a punchy track with wonky guitar and an earworm bass line, and David's vocal delivery is just so urgent on this track. A really, really good song. This record culminated in the huge Reality tour. This was the last world tour that David Bowie did. There's a live album as well if you want to go and listen to that. It was such an energetic, a really great live performance, and he toured that over so many countries. It did as a result leave him completely exhausted, and he did suffer a heart attack during this time as well. After this, he purposefully took a back seat in his solo career. He still collaborated with a lot of artists, did loads of different collaborations. I'm not going to list them all here, but it's worth checking out what they were. Someone who's so creative and so artistic and from such an early age, it must be very difficult to switch off that mode of thought even as you're approaching your later years. In 2013, The Next Day was announced completely out of the blue, surprising fans all around the world, most of them believing that Reality was the swan song of a retired Bowie. Nope. He wasn't done yet. The artwork was designed by Jonathan Barnbrook, who took the original cover from 77's Heroes and placed a square over the top and crossed out the title. Here's how he explained the album art. No matter how much we try, we cannot break free from the past. It always looms large, and people will judge you always in relation to your history, no matter how much you try to escape it. The obscuring of an image from the past is also about the wider human condition. We move on relentlessly in our lives to the next day, leaving the past because we have no choice but to. The lead single was the morose Where Are We Now, a beautiful song that honestly sits up there for me as one of his best tracks. An emotional and somber ballad of piano and strings, all the production geared towards Bowie's still captivating vocal delivery. Had to get the train from Potsdamer Platz. You never knew that I could do that. Just walking the dead. Clearly the Berlin days loomed large in the production of this album, from the cover of Heroes used as the album art to his memories of being in Germany during the 1970s. That's actually the most somber track on the album. The rest is a fairly fierce, ragged rock album that shares more DNA with the first half of Heroes than you might have initially thought. The opening title track is almost like a copy of the Heroes opener, Beauty and the Beast. It has the same propulsive energy and irresistible stomp. The Stars Are Out Tonight was the second single released and has the same sort of energy as title track The Next Day, but it sounds more akin from something from the Scary Monsters sessions, which certainly isn't a bad thing at all. The track is a comment on celebrity. They burn you with their radiant smiles, trap you with their beautiful eyes. They're broke and shamed, or drunk or scared, but I hope they live forever. Really, for me, this is, on the whole, the most cohesive and creatively successful record in Bowie's catalogue since the release of Scary Monsters in 1980. It's a brilliant record. Also worth checking out the Next Day extra EP that was released around the time, containing the track Atomica, which sounds like something from his early 70s heyday. Really great, check that out. After this release, the V&A Museum did an incredible exhibition called David Bowie Is, which was a massive retrospective from his early 60s days, both music and fashion, right the way up to 2013's The Next Day. And alongside that, The Next Day, the album debuted at #1 on the UK charts. The whole thing was just evolved this hugely voracious appetite for David Bowie once again. And new people, younger people were discovering him for the first time and getting into his old albums and appreciating The Next Day for what it was as well. And the whole thing, it was like being in the midst of an artist who was having a great resurgence. Then, on the 8th of January 2016, on his 69th birthday, David Bowie releases Black Star to immediate critical acclaim. One day in 2014, Bowie walked into a bar not far from his home in New York and sat down to watch the performance of a jazz band fronted by Donny McCaslin. And they did the sonic footprint. There was a mixture of inspiration from Weather Report, Miles Davis, and also electronic curios like Aphex Twin. David was so impressed that he invited them to secret recording sessions with himself and Tony Visconti, and together they crafted a brilliant work of ambition, depth, and integrity. This is a blend of dark jazz, electronica, and rock that honestly sits up there with his best LPs. This is a Heroes, a Low, a Ziggy Stardust, a Hunky Dory, and a Lad Insane. It's magical and it's a masterpiece. Bowie's risk of shacking up with jazz musicians he'd never worked before really pays off. He utilised their musical dynamism and creativity and fed his own artistic creativity off of that, creating something that's very unique in his catalogue, but that is ostensibly a David Bowie album. The nearly 10-minute opener, Black Star, is an odyssey of texture and gloom, and Bowie's new band make themselves apparent in the first opening minutes. You have Mark Guiliana's skittery, dynamic drum beat, which is propelling the swells of saxophone from Donny McCaslin, when the minimalist bass of Tim Lefebvre just ebbs along underneath the soundscape. It feels so right for this record to have such a focus on saxophone again. After all, it was one of Bowie's first instruments he played in his childhood, and it turns up again and again throughout Bowie's discography in all its chameleonic forms. The record is only 7 tracks long, but it ensures that the whole thing feels like everything has an intention and a purpose, and everything coheres, everything works together. There's no filler here. Every moment is vital as the next. Sue, or In a Season of Crime, is a great experimental paranoid track. It's got these polyrhythmic guitar lines and intricate drum beats, and the whole thing ends with this basically a drum and bass breakdown, which is so unexpected, and it sounds like it would be out of place, but it just fits the song so well. The second single, Lazarus, had the most impact to audiences around the world, as when he passed away on the 10th of January 2016, only 2 days after the release of Black Star. It became apparent through the lyricism of this song, as well as everything else, that this was his epitaph. Black Star is his gift to the world and his final farewell. Look up here, I'm in heaven. I've got scars that can't be seen. I've got drama, can't be stolen. Everybody knows me now. This record has become somewhat immortalised due to the fact that he died 2 days after releasing this album, and the fact that the album so intimately details the fact that this is his final farewell. But I really want to make this clear, and I made this clear in the last video where I spoke about Black Star. This album's a masterpiece because it's a masterpiece, not just due to its circumstance. It's an urgent, driving, beautiful record that, even regardless of that circumstance, it just stands up there with some of his best albums, and it shouldn't just be viewed as this incidental final record that was released a few days before a death. It's actually a really poetic, beautiful piece of work. I feel like the final track on the album deals with his death more revealingly than anything else. It begins with the harmonica sound from 77's New Career in a New Town off of Low, and it features Bowie in his most crooning capacity. Seeing more and feeling less, saying no but meaning yes. This is all I ever meant. That's the message that I sent. Bowie had grand plans for this album, and in his last throes released an album that sits up there with all of his great albums from the 70s. It's a masterpiece, and it should be listened to with as much reverence and love as albums like Low, Heroes, Ziggy Stardust, A Lad Insane, Hunky Dory, etc, etc, etc. I have to end with a quote because I feel it's the only fitting thing that I can do. I don't know where I'm going from here, but I promise it won't be boring. He is immortalised in this quote, a tireless visionary who literally changed people's lives with the music he made. He has left behind a legacy that will be remembered for a very long time, and I feel incredibly lucky to be able to experience his music. When his death was announced, I stumbled across this post on Reddit, which made me smile. If you're ever sad, just remember the world is 4.543 billion years old, and you somehow managed to exist at the same time as David Bowie. Thanks, David. And thanks for watching this guide. Make sure that you comment below and talk about all your favourite Bowie moments, your favourite Bowie records. You know, I haven't been able to detail every single thing about his career because it fills books and documentaries. So if you want to enlighten the community with any other bits of information I haven't included, then make sure you include it below. I know I've mentioned this a million times, but my final David Bowie week video will be up on Saturday the 7th of January, just before his birthday, so make sure you go and check that out. And I will be back with my first episode in the Deep Cuts Essentials series soon, so I'll see you there.